My best friend went missing in the woods. When he returned, his parents refused to let me see what he'd become at night. Written by Everblack Death Mask. I've gone back and forth for a while on whether I should post this. I won't share the names of the people involved. I'll use aliases to protect their identities, or the town this happened in due to the ongoing investigation. What I will tell you is what I experienced to the best of my ability. I know how this is going to sound, but I promise that every word of what I'm about to tell you is true, especially what happened after sundown. On the edge of a small town, where cicadas droned in the trees and the air carried the sweetness of pine sap, Danny and I grew up together. He was the kind of kid who could make small adventures into epic ones. Scavenger hunts along the reservoir trails, races up the old water tower, and ghost stories by flashlight in the backyard tent were just a few of my favorite memories with him. All of that changed last fall when he and his dad Neil went on a hunting trip a few towns away. He was supposed to be back in time for his 16th birthday. Bad horror movies, video games, and lots of pizza were what we had planned, but that day never came. Only his dad came back home. I distinctly remember hearing his mother's reaction when she realized her son hadn't returned. Her scream tore across the yards between our houses, causing the birds and nearby trees to scatter. Neil had woken up to an empty tent and searched the woods all morning before calling the police. Joined by volunteers from all around town, they combed the area for days, but not a single trace of Danny was found. Word spread around the town that Danny had vanished overnight. Despite his dad being the last one to see him alive, and how strange it all was, no one questioned it too much. His parents were well liked, after all, and Neil also had old hunting buddies in the police department. They took his word at face value, and as a result, no charges were filed. The investigation went cold only after a couple of weeks. Weeks blurred into months, and Danny still never turned up. I barely left the house. The sadness that crept into Danny's home eventually seeped into mine. Their house was nothing more than darkness breathing through the slats of blinds day and night. Aside from the groaning porch swing and the clink of beer bottles hitting the ground outside, I respected the silence from next door. Even from my window, I could see the bags underneath his parents' eyes as they sat out back late into the night. Eventually, they stopped going out altogether. I clung to the idea that they were only grieving, that everything was normal. But what happened at school one afternoon convinced me otherwise. I remember my calculus teacher, Miss Parker, had left a stack of graded papers out on her desk. When I went to staple my homework, the paper on top caught my eye. Danny's name was scribbled on it in the same messy cursive I had seen 100 times before. When I asked Miss Parker how Danny had turned it in, she simply said, "Oh, his mother dropped it off this morning before school started. He's catching up on missed assignments from home." As she explained everything to me, I could only stare at his name written across the top of the page. I recognized the deep pressure grooves. He always pressed down too hard on his pencil when he was annoyed with his schoolwork. It was unmistakably his handwriting, and that only made things worse. Instead of relief, all I felt was dread. If Danny was alive and turning in his homework, why hadn't he reached out to me? The thought unsettled me, but rather than press for questions, I nodded and went back to my seat. I tried to focus on my schoolwork, but the only thing that was on my mind was Danny's paper. A missing kid suddenly turning in his homework should have been the talk of the whole town. So why wasn't anyone talking about Danny at all? His parents didn't seem like the kind of people to hide things, but I couldn't help but feel as though everyone knew something that I didn't. After school, I went to Danny's in an attempt to get some answers. I knocked on the door, and his parents answered. When I had asked if Danny was home, they flat out denied it, almost offended I had even asked. When I told them that I had seen his homework in class, though, their tune changed completely. "Oh, you saw," Kathleen sighed. "We were hoping to keep this private." Her smile faltered at the corners as her face tightened. "Danny contracted a severe viral infection in the woods, and his immune system's very weak. He can't leave the house yet. We've been turning in his homework so he doesn't fall behind. Well, can I at least say hi? I asked, much to the dismay of Neil, who angrily shook his head. His bloodshot eyes glared at me as he loomed behind Kathleen in the doorway. No, his voice cracked like a whip before softening. No, he can't have contact with anybody right now. It's too risky. When he's healthy again, that's when you can see him. Kathleen's eyes darted around, looking to see if the coast was clear. Please don't tell anyone. We don't want people talking. She whispered, like she was afraid someone might overhear. Before I could get another word in, they closed the door in my face. I stood there on the front porch for a while. I left more confused than when I first arrived. When I eventually came home, I told my parents about my visit to check on Danny. They seemed irritated at the fact that I'd gone over there and harassed his parents about their son. He's been gone for months. We thought he was dead. Why is nobody making a bigger deal out of this? But my question fell on deaf ears as my parents dismissed my concerns. Once again, I felt like I was the only one who was suspicious of everything. Frustrated, I went upstairs and spent the rest of the day in my room. Sometime after midnight, movement in Danny's room caught my attention. A towering slouched silhouette moved slowly in the darkness behind his curtains. I watched a twitching hand pull the fabric to the side and tap on the glass once, twice, 3 times. Moonlight flashed across 2 glassy eyes staring directly into my room. Before I could see more, the curtains shut. I shuddered as I struggled to rationalize what I had seen. I wanted to believe that it was Danny, but the height and movement didn't match him. For the sake of everyone involved, and maybe for my own sanity, I let things be. Every day played out the same way for the next few months. I pretended everything was fine, even when it wasn't. Then, after what felt like a whole lifetime of waiting, Danny's parents called. They said he would be attending school again once spring break was over. I was relieved, as was everyone else when the news spread around town. The end of spring break felt like it couldn't have come fast enough. When that day arrived, I got to school early and waited for him outside of our English class together. I froze the moment I saw him again. There he was, same freckles, crooked grin, and dark brown hair that barely brushed his eyebrows. It was like he'd never disappeared, except for the heavy crescents under his eyes and the way he stiffly walked. I just assumed that these were side effects from the infection he had. We picked up right where we'd left off before his hunting trip. Over lunch, I caught him up on everything that had gone on in my life since he had been gone. When I told Danny the rumors about him, that ranged from flesh-eating virus to alien abduction, he laughed so hard that chocolate milk came out of his nose. It was fun getting to talk to him again. Eventually, I asked how his recovery had been like, and he got very quiet, almost dismissive. He changed the subject every time it was brought up, so I stopped trying to talk about it. I noticed Danny's behavior grow more and more odd in the following days. He seemed to always be tracking the time when we hung out after school. During our walks around town, he would constantly ask what time it was, so often that it became a nervous tick. I'd also catch him glancing upwards at the sky, like he was monitoring its movements. Whenever the sun descended even slightly, his eyes would fill with fear. Even stranger was his mom's car pulling up to my house the second it started to get dark outside. There would be a single sustained honk that would echo from the street, and Danny would grow pale instantly. Gotta go. He'd mumble under his breath before quickly taking off. He never looked back when he hurried away into the night. For a while, everything felt ordinary again. Those afternoons of video games and bike rides around town blurred together as weeks slipped by. Eventually, summertime arrived, but the heat only made things weirder. For some reason, Danny still wore long sleeves, jeans, and a jacket during heat advisory weather. I joked that he had turned into a vampire, but he just insisted that he was cold. This was a kid who used to go shirtless anytime the temperature broke 70. Now he dressed like it was the middle of January. I shrugged it off, not wanting to ruin the fun of hanging out together. But then came the night that changed everything between us. We were in my basement, working on an allelopathy project for our biology class. My parents were at a blood drive, so we had the whole house to ourselves. I had just finished writing down our data when Danny asked me what time it was. I had seen the sky turn a bright orange color earlier, but I hadn't checked the time. When I pulled out my phone and told him that it was shortly after 6, he looked like he was on the very verge of a panic attack. The color had completely drained from his face. He trembled violently as he stared out the window, watching the orange light fade into dying rays of violet. I wanted to dismiss the way he was acting, but something about the way his eyes locked onto the fading light outside gave me goosebumps. It was like he was counting down the seconds before something awful happened. I have to go. The remaining light slanted across his face, turning his skin almost translucent. Before I could even question what was happening, he rose to his feet. He clutched his stomach, doubling over like he was going to hurl before sprinting upstairs. "Danny, what's going on?" I called out as he ran to the bathroom and closed the door behind him. A few seconds later, a low cracking noise reverberated behind the door. It sounded like ice on a lake before it broke. I softly knocked a couple of times. "Danny, you okay in there?" I waited a few seconds before a reply, but there was no response. I pressed my ear against the door and heard a snap that resembled old wood bending towards its breaking point. Underneath it, grunts of pain and labored breathing. If he hadn't been acting so odd before, I would have assumed that the pizza from our trip to the gas station earlier had made his stomach upset. But my gut was telling me that something was wrong. My suspicions were confirmed when I heard the doorbell incessantly ring. I ran upstairs and opened the front door to see his mom, Kathleen. She looked frantic, more frightened than angry. She didn't just walk, she lunged past me with the coat in her hands. "Where is he?" she questioned, her voice shaking. "In the bathroom, but..." Without hesitation, she marched down the hall towards the bathroom. Her keys jangled in her pocket as she pounded the door with her fist. "Danny, it's Mom. Open the door this instant," she called out, eyes wide with fear. The sound of choked sobbing came from behind the door as it opened. In between the slight crack in the door, I thought I saw an arm with the color and texture of varnished wood. Danny's mom obstructed my view, preventing me from seeing more as she barged into the bathroom. She helped Danny put on a coat before pulling him into a hug. "It's okay, sweetheart. I've got you." Moments later, they emerged from the bathroom. Danny had his head down the entire time Kathleen told me that Danny wasn't allowed over anymore. Afterward, she and Danny left, not even bothering to close the front door behind them. That was the last time he was ever over at my house. I didn't know it at the time, but I had just witnessed a crucial piece of a much larger mystery fall into place. Looking back, it seemed like nothing more than an awkward moment in our teen years. Something we could look back on and laugh when we were older. Nothing could have prepared me for that evening to be the beginning of a goodbye, and yet the signs were all there. I had ignored them at the time because I didn't understand them. If I had known that that night was going to be the last time he actually felt like my friend, I would have done and said so much more. The truth was, I had already lost him, just not in any way I could have ever imagined. Danny didn't come to school the next day, or the days after. The texts I sent him stayed undelivered, and every time I called his house, I was told he was resting. Days became weeks, and eventually, they stopped answering my calls altogether. After a month went by, and I still hadn't heard from Danny, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I wasn't about to lose my friend again without a fight. I asked my teachers if I could drop off Danny's homework, and when they agreed, I knew I finally had the excuse to check on him. I rode my bike over to his house and told myself I'd be quick. I thought I heard a faint scream as I stepped onto the porch. I assumed Danny was watching a scary movie as I rang the doorbell, but nobody answered. I rang again, and still nothing. The noise from inside grew louder and frayed my nerves. "Danny?" I shouted as I tried the doorknob. To my surprise, it turned with ease. Inside, plates of half-eaten food sat untouched beneath the flicker of a muted TV. Crumbs were scattered across the floor, while mail was strewn across the kitchen counter. I left his homework on the kitchen table and searched the house. My search eventually led me to the basement door. It was the only place I hadn't checked. When I opened it, I gagged at the bitter chemical fumes that rolled out. My eyes watered as I took the stairs one at a time. My foot slipped slightly on the slick floorboards, and when I looked down, the entire stairwell shimmered with a rainbow sheen like rain puddles under a streetlight. Why was there gasoline all over the place? Each soaked stair squeaked under my weight as I did my best not to lose my balance. Halfway down, a screech morphed into an anxious whimper. "Danny?" I called out into the darkness. I heard something moving as I rushed down the rest of the way down and turned the light on. The basement opened into a long rectangular room. At the far right corner, the stairs emptied out near a far wall, giving me a full view of the room from an angle. Bags of blood littered the floor. Some were collapsed and drained of all their contents, while others remained full. Old shelves and furniture lined the walls, all soaked with gasoline just like the stairs. To my right stood a cluttered workbench. To the left, an old-looking sink and laundry machine. A wooden frame braced with thick ropes and nails sat in the center of the concrete floor, positioned about 10 feet away. The wood looked refastened in several places, as though it had been repaired more than once. What I saw inside made my legs lock in place and my heart stop. It was Danny. His skin was covered in purple, almost green bruises and welts. He smelled like stale sweat, as if he hadn't moved in days. The clothes he wore hung off him like they had belonged to someone twice his size. Hidden under his hair were sunken eyes that struggled to focus on his surroundings. "Dude," I whispered, my shoes squelched in the gasoline as I frantically looked around for a way to free him. "Danny?" Danny blinked, clearly disorientated. A weak moan left his cracked lips flecked with blood. He moved his head like he had heard my voice through water. "You need to leave." His words came out hoarse, like he'd been yelling for hours. "You shouldn't be here." "What are they doing to you, man?" I stepped toward him, but he flinched backward. "Don't worry, I'm going to get you out of here." Don't touch anything. They're trying to help." "Help?" I snapped. "You look like a hostage. Your parents have you tied up in a basement. Danny, what the fuck is going on?" He shut his eyes, and with clenched teeth, he wrapped his shaking arms tight around his ribs, as if he were holding himself together. "Leave, while you still can," he replied weakly. He looked so scared, and that broke my heart in a way few things ever have. Before I could say anything further, heavy footsteps thundered across the floor upstairs. Danny's terrified breath sloshed in his lungs as I comforted him. "It's okay, I'm not letting them hurt you." The basement door flew open, and Neil almost tumbled down the stairs as he rushed to plant himself between me and Danny. Kathleen followed close behind, but lingered just above the bottom step. She was chalk white and looked torn between retreat and descent. Neil locked eyes on Danny, looking as though he had been shot in the chest. They stayed right in front of the stairs behind me, blocking our only exit. "You shouldn't be here," he shouted, pulling me away from Danny. "You're abusing him," I yelled. "Look at him. You're starving him and keeping him tied up like an animal." Kathleen sobbed and gripped the railing. "You don't understand. You need to get away from him." "I understand enough." I shot back, wiggling free from Neil's grasp to stand between them and Danny. "I'm calling the police." "No!" Kathleen shrieked. No, you can't. You don't know what you're doing." "He's scared of you," I shouted as a loud crack split the basement air. "Neil, it's starting," Kathleen whispered. I had never heard an adult sound that afraid before. I whipped around to see Danny had collapsed into a fetal curl, his spine lifted upwards under the skin. He was only a few feet away, but close enough that I could hear every sound. Neil and Kathleen were wedged behind me at the base of the stairs. Neil's breathing turned ragged as his eyes fixated on the vertebrae that strained under Danny's tightly pulled skin. He struck the floor repeatedly with his fists, causing dust to rain down from the ceiling. I felt sick to my stomach as I watched my friend whimper in pain. Underneath his shirt, his shoulder blades jutted out. They sharply pressed against the fabric to get free. A howl, caught between human and monster, tore itself from his throat. His fingers suddenly twisted at angles no joints were designed to bend at. Both Kathleen and Neil flinched in unison at the sight. I stood there, mouth agape, as the veins under his skin darkened into a color of old tree sap. Tears trailed from Danny's eyes as his skin ripped violently. His flesh split apart so loudly that the sound reverberated through the floor. I stumbled back a step when I saw the panels of dark, lacquered timber underneath the torn skin. The polished wood gleamed as the boards slid outward in jagged, overlapping plates. The harsh crack of his bones nearly drowned out what he said next. "Please, not in front of him," Danny screamed frantically. "I don't want him to see me like this." Danny tried to speak one last time, but the only word, "Mom," escaped his lips. The rest of his sentence became some unintelligible guttural sound mid-syllable. With a force that delivered a splintering crack, his neck jerked to the side, making Kathleen wince. Then, Danny's breathing stopped entirely, and his body went quiet and limp. My knees knocked together uncontrollably as I struggled to stand. Kathleen backed up until her shoulders hit the concrete wall on my left. Her hand slid down the wall as she pleaded, "Not again. Please, not again." Neil reached a hand out toward Danny, but yanked it back when his jaw unhinged sideways. He lifted his head slowly and snapped it back in place with a wet pop. A groan came from the ropes on the frame as they stretched, barely able to restrain Danny as he grew taller. A wooden moan came from within his body when the tendons in his arms stretched and pulled taut. The gasoline on the floor under him rippled with each of his convulsions, reflecting light and shadows in trembling colors. His eyes, wide with apology, locked onto mine before the irises of his eyes ballooned, then vanished entirely into a pitch-black shine. His gums split open, revealing serrated teeth that scraped and clicked forward inside his widening mouth. They rearranged and lengthened themselves at an alarming rate. The nails on his fingers bruised and shredded until they resembled miniature wooden stakes. "Get away from him! Move!" Kathleen pressed herself against the far wall. Her shaking hands covered her mouth in a vain attempt to silence her distress. Neil stepped in front of me, trying to block my line of sight to Danny. Kathleen stood by Neil's side and gripped his arm, knuckles widening like it was the only thing keeping her upright. In her eyes, I could see fear and the exhaustion of someone who had been through this too many times. "What did you do to him?" I asked, terrified at what I had seen my friend become. A vessel of flesh and wood for the soul, and a life for a life to keep it whole, Kathleen recited like a prayer. Danny yanked at his restraints, the ropes fraying beneath the growing strength of his new body. "What?" It was all I could manage to speak. "It's what the person who promised to help told us. We saved Danny, but not completely." Neil grabbed me from the back of my shirt and pulled me towards the basement stairs. He became emotional as he tried to explain. "Danny died. It was all my fault. I was cleaning the gun when he snuck up on me. My finger pulled the trigger out of instinct, and I ran home and told Kathleen." He swallowed hard, fighting a losing battle to hold back tears. "We found someone, a craftsman who promised that Danny could be brought back." His hands shook as he wiped his eyes. This craftsman built a ventriloquist doll in Danny's image from the bark of the trees in the woods he died in. A life had to be taken in order to restore Danny's. We refused to go through with it, but the ritual couldn't be undone. So Danny came back, but not completely. He's normal during the day, but at night, he turns into that monster. There is no cure. We've done our best to contain him, but he's becoming uncontrollable," Kathleen added quietly. He can't have anything except blood. I've had to steal bags of blood from my job at the hospital and the blood drive to keep him fed. His hunger is only getting worse." Neil suddenly pulled me into a hug, sobbing into my shirt. "We didn't know. God, we didn't know." Danny died. Those two words together were a concept that my brain refused to grasp, but my heart fully acknowledged. With teary eyes, I looked to face the monster that had taken over my best friend. When I looked into the black gleam of his eyes, I thought I saw a glimpse of my friend behind them. "Help me." The monstrous bellow rumbled from his throat. In that sliver of a moment, I swear he remembered me like I remembered him. Seeing Danny not in control of himself broke something inside of me. This was the kid I used to build blanket forts with. The one who used to pretend that our bikes were spaceships and make loud pew-pew laser noises as we rode around our street. Part of me knew I shouldn't have freed him, but the part that begged myself to took over. I rushed forward and tore at his restraints. "No!" Neil cried as he chased after me. "Don't free him!" But he wasn't fast enough. The last of the ropes broke loose, one fiber at a time, as Danny's head turned toward us. Without hesitation, his mouth opened wide and he lurched towards us. His arm clattered fiercely as he swung his arm and knocked me backward. My body struck the workbench with a force that felt like running into someone wearing a backpack full of bricks. Jars, nails, and tools toppled off and scattered across the gasoline-coated floor, pinging like metal raindrops. Pain exploded all over my shoulders and back from the impact. But before I could even react, Danny was on top of me. I felt his sawdust-scented breath on my face as his claws raked across the skin of my forearm. Blood oozed from the wound as I screamed and tried to shove him back. We struggled for a moment before Neil charged from my right and grabbed him with his left arm. He tried to pull him away from me, but that turned out to be a bad idea. Danny seized him around the torso and hurled him toward the bookcase on the right side of the room. The impact of the crash broke the bookcase and made warm droplets of gasoline fall from the rafters, crossing the room in only a couple of strides as Neil laid in the wreckage in a crumbled heap. Kathleen fumbled for one of the blood bags on the floor near the stairs. She waved it desperately in an attempt to distract their son. Danny, please!" He pivoted toward Kathleen, his limbs scraping against the concrete as he approached her in stiff strides. Thud, thud, thud. Each one of his footsteps were heavier than the last on the oil-slick floor. His head clicked like a puppet with too many strings being yanked at once as he faced her. He sank his teeth into her hand, the injury slicing her hand open. She collapsed to the floor as blood formed in a messy pool beneath her. "Run! Go! Now!" Neil cried out, using the remains of the bookcase to help lift himself back to his feet. He pulled the matchbook from out of his pocket, and when I saw the matches, I understood everything immediately. I ran towards the stairs, but not before I heard a match being struck. The flame flickered faintly in Danny's black eyes before Neil threw it toward the floor beneath him. My eyes followed its descent to the floor. In mere seconds, the gasoline ignited. With a booming whoosh, the fire roared to life in front of Neil, completely overtaking him in a sacrifice by self-immolation. A wave of heat barreled across the room. Flames raced along the soaked trails on the floor in serpentine lines before climbing the walls, turning the stairwell into a pillar of fire. Smoke drifted across the ceiling as Danny thrashed wildly, shrieking in agony as he burned. Kathleen crawled towards him on the basement floor, sobbing his name repeatedly as the flames consumed her. He didn't even acknowledge her. Danny only knew two things in that moment: pain and hunger. I bolted up the stairs 2 at a time, using the wall to keep my balance as smoke followed behind. The acrid smell of burning wood and skin glued itself to my lungs as I exited the basement and stumbled into the kitchen. Clutching my injured arm, I barely made it through the front door to safety before the heat engulfed the doorway behind me. The windows exploded outward, and shards of glass flew across the front lawn like a swarm of angry hornets. Blood trailed down my arm as I laid in the yard, coughing up the ash in my mouth. The cold grass hugged my skin as I watched Danny's burning silhouette in the basement window. The brittle popping of glass filled the air as smoke permeated across the yard in thick, billowing waves. I wheezed with a force that rattled my whole body and struggled to my feet. My legs barely worked as I forced myself upright to run home. When I got inside, I fumbled with the phone so badly I almost dropped it. I managed to dial 911 and report the fire to the operator, but not what I saw in the basement. Just as I hung up, I heard Danny's scream rip through the night air. It echoed for a while before being smothered by the roar of the blaze next door. By the time I stepped outside once again, the frantic, orange pillars of the fire had died. Red embers and black ash rested in the crater where Danny's house once stood. I stood on the sidewalk as neighbors gathered around in a stunned silence. I remember someone had asked me if I needed water, and another had asked if I was okay, but I didn't respond to anyone. My eyes latched onto the others that poured out onto their lawns. They murmured and pointed in disbelief at the aftermath. Somewhere in the distance behind me, I heard the approaching sirens wail, but the world felt muffled and distant. Next thing I knew, I was sitting inside the back of an ambulance with an oxygen mask on. An EMT shined a light in my eyes and clipped something to my finger. I felt the ice-cold touch of gauze press against my arm as one of the paramedics asked me where I had been during the fire. I barely understood the question because of the blaring siren, but the last thing I remember was the lie I told before the ceiling swayed in slow motion and everything went dark. The news reports in the days that followed felt like a lie I was being forced to accept. Faulty wiring was deemed as the official cause of Danny's home burning to the ground. There was nothing about what I had told the police, but admittedly, I withheld information. Not because I wanted to, but because I would sound like a lunatic if I told them what truly happened that night. Freeing my best friend who had turned into a monster would get me locked in a psych ward before I could explain myself fully. Despite the ongoing nature of the investigation, no remains nor evidence have turned up. Danny and his parents were declared missing by the police, but everyone around here believes they snapped under the pressure of their own secrets and ran. There was nothing to prove otherwise, just baseless speculation. Maybe the speculation comforts everyone else, but not me. I know what I saw, but what's even worse is I know what broke loose. I shouldn't feel any loyalty to whatever he'd become, but some part of me keeps trying to reassure myself that he's still in there somewhere. I keep replaying the moment I freed him, and the way his real voice forced its way out of his monstrous form just long enough to say, "Help me." I'm not sure if I saved him from a fate worse than death, or if I've dragged the rest of us into one. What do I even begin to do? I don't want to confess what I know, but what would I even say? I can't let Danny hurt anyone else, but I also know a part of me is selfishly protecting the memory of who Danny used to be. If I tell the truth, I destroy what's left of that. That's the choice I'm burdened with. So that's why I'm here. I'm asking strangers online for advice that probably won't save me or my town. Every night since the fire, I've heard him. His joints creak outside, and the gentle tap 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 on my window has followed shortly after. I've memorized the pattern. It's Danny's way of telling me that he's still out there. I never look, and I don't want to, because if I do, I won't see Danny anymore. I'll see the monster that I freed.